I hope you're all doing well today. Thank you so much for spending part of your Saturday with us. My name is Shokoofeh Rajabzadeh. I'm a PhD student at UC Berkeley, and I'm a member of the Executive Board of RaceB4Race. It is a great honor for me to be moderating the last panel of this year's conference, Education, which promises to be an excellent one. Our speakers for today are Dr. Andrea Achi, Dr. Nedda Mehdizadeh, and Dr. Barbara Bordalejo. Although I'd love to give you a long bio for each of them, listing all their rich accomplishments and contributions to the field for which we are all so grateful, for the sake of time, I will ask that you instead turn to the bios available in the conference's program. The structure of today's session will be as follows. Each of the speakers will present immediately following one another, without any pauses in between. Once they have all presented, I will moderate a question and answer dialogue for the remainder of our time together. Please use the Q&A box to ask your questions, which is located at the bottom of the screen, titled Q&A. That will be the only way we can receive your questions. And feel free to ask questions over the course of the talk. You don't have to wait till the end. We'll ask the questions at the end, but you can kind of ask them as they come to you. Also, please note that closed captioning is available. If you'd like to take advantage of it, please push the CC button at the bottom of the screen. Finally, for any and all tweeters, please use the hashtag RaceB4Race so that we can keep track of everyone's comments and reflections. With that, it is my great pleasure and honor to ask Andrea Achi to begin. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So the prompt for this conference asked us to interrogate how we teach our fields, why we teach our fields, and whom we implicitly and explicitly include and exclude in the process. I approach this question through my curatorial work. I view my work as a teaching tool for a broad range of learners. A diversity of peoples walk through the Met galleries every day. Kindergarteners from the Upper East Side of Manhattan, undergraduates from Brooklyn, international retired scholars from France, and all in between, locally, nationally, globally. Through these galleries, many people first encounter the medieval world. And we are privileged to make these encounters an accessible public resource. As a tool to teach the public about our field, the curatorial practice goes beyond permanent collection, installations, and large-scale loan exhibitions. We do this work also through our outreach, partnerships, and programs. In this talk, I will discuss how curators have expanded public perception of the medieval world by deepening and disseminating knowledge through scholarly research and balancing our commitment to object-centered work with a concern for larger historical and theoretical questions that address a broader context that's multidisciplinary. I will begin by presenting an overview of past medieval exhibitions that have done this type of work, exhibitions that push the boundaries of the medieval world. Then I will talk a little bit about how exhibitions can be viewed as pipelines to medieval studies and how we can practically use curatorial practice to diversify the field of medieval studies. I will end with brief case studies on two museum objects I've been thinking a lot about. These are late Roman artworks that have representations of Africans. I will discuss how curators and scholars have approached these objects and the potential for displaying objects like these to show the diversity of the pre-modern world. Over the past 25 years, the Metropolitan Museum's medieval departments organized multiple exhibitions that did this type of work, pushing boundaries and showing diversity. Of course, I'm biased, but our Byzantinist, Helen Evans, for exhibition expanded the field. In the next few slides, I'm going to read some of the exhibition descriptions of her show. In 1997, The Glory of Byzantium explored four interrelated themes: the religious and secular culture of the Second Golden Age of the Byzantine Empire, the empire's interactions with its Christian neighbors and rivals, its relations with Islamic East, its contact with the Latin West, bringing together the contributions of 59 scholars and art historians, most of them working in the United States, The exhibition explored the complex current of the Byzantine civilizations. More than 350 works of art assembled for the exhibition came from 119 institutions in 24 countries, and they were discussed and illustrated in a catalog. In 2004, the Byzantium Faith and Power, which focused on exceptional works of secular and religious art produced by late Byzantine artists. These works were emulated and transformed by other Eastern Christian centers of power, among them Russia, Serbia, Bulgaria, and Armenia. The Islamic world adapted motifs drawn from Byzantium's imperial past as Christian minorities in the Muslim East continued Byzantine customs. From Italy to the lowlands, Byzantium's artistic and intellectual practices deeply influenced the development of the Renaissance, while, in turn, Byzantium's own traditions reflected the empire's connections with the Latin West. And fine example of these interrelationships were illustrated by important panel paintings, ceramics, and illuminated manuscripts, among other objects. 2012, Byzantium Islam was a groundbreaking exhibition that explored transformations and unexpected continuities in the Byzantine Empire from the 7th to the 9th century. And as the period opened, the empire's southern provinces, the vibrant, diverse areas of North Africa and Eastern Mediterranean, were at the crossroads of trade routes reaching from Spain to China. These regions experienced historical upheavals when their Christian and Jewish communities encountered the emerging Islamic world. And by the 9th century, an unprecedented cross-fertilization of cultures had taken place. So in summary, the Byzantine shows at the Met consistently displayed a vibrant and interconnected medieval world. Other shows that we've done, such as the Jerusalem exhibition, also presented new possibilities in understanding medieval art. And again, I'll read the description. So beginning around the year 1000, Jerusalem attained unprecedented significance as a location, destination, and symbol to people of diverse faiths, from Iceland to India. Multiple competitive and complementary religious traditions, fueled by an almost universal preoccupation with the city, gave rise to one of the most creative periods in history. My colleagues at the Getty, of course, organized exhibitions that created entry points to many of the topics driving our field now, such as global Middle Ages, outsiders, trade routes, representations of Africans. Most recently, Caravans of Gold, organized by Kathleen Verzark, highlighted the connections between the medieval world and West Africa. And whereas scholarship on medieval Africa has been ongoing, her exhibition really brought the topic to the public. And her description, and travel with the Black Museum along routes crossing the Sahara Desert to a time when West African gold fueled expansive trade and drove the movement of people, cultures, and religious beliefs. Caravans of Gold is the first major exhibition addressing the scope of Saharan trade and the shared history of West Africa, the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe from the 8th to the 16th centuries. Weaving stories about interconnected histories, the exhibition showcases the objects and ideas that connected at the crossroads of the medieval Sahara and celebrates West Africa's historic and under-recognized global significance. In all of these exhibitions, regions not usually considered to be a part of medieval or Byzantine studies were seamlessly incorporated. These exhibitions stretched what is deemed to be Byzantine or medieval art by creating new frameworks to understand these works in the original context. And with each of these exhibitions, I know we all felt the ground of our field slightly shift. Children and teenagers encountered new ways of thinking about the medieval world. The exhibition catalogs began to show up on undergraduate and graduate surveys. The exhibition narratives became woven within scholarly discourses. But these exhibitions and their subsequent publications are not only crucial for our field, but they're also untapped opportunities to encourage more students to pursue medieval studies and art history. Because of these reasons, I consider exhibitions to be pipeline initiatives. So we can take a two-tiered approach to this idea. First, as I mentioned, exhibitions are a public educational resource for K-12 students, academia, and the general public. And we know this. But I think museums can be more strategic about their programming to open up the possibilities of the field. Second, exhibitions have long lives beyond the 3 months that the installation is open. And the planning process provides training opportunities to help create an inclusive and equitable field. These exhibitions champion sustainable partnerships with both local and international communities. For example, during the development of the Glory of Byzantium, Helen Evans developed a conservation training program for Egyptian students. The program's participants are now in influential positions related to museums and cultural heritage management in Egypt. The exhibitions I mentioned earlier all of them provided training opportunities for diverse groups to collaborate on exhibition development, catalogs, and programmings. And each of these opportunities helped with application to graduate school, CVs for the job market, and so on. And indeed, we can't depend on one or two institutions to do this work, right? Of creating an inclusive space to allow BIPOC students to thrive. But what if keepers and curators of every medieval collection view the upcoming exhibitions as an opportunity to diversify our field? What if we work together? Universities, colleges, particularly HBCUs, museums, libraries, to help students get hands-on training with object-centered research. And our interns don't have to start out as medievalists, but we can introduce them to our work. I'm going to use the Met as an example again. But here we have educational programs for K-12 students. And in these programs, we can use opportunities to tell the stories of medieval objects, but then also help students think critically about the relationship to these objects. So in these programs, we discuss original context and how these artworks got into the museum. We also have high school, undergraduate, and graduate internships that are paid. We mentor these students and encourage them to take Latin and Greek and other necessary courses that will help them get into competitive graduate programs. And these internship programs are often tied to development of exhibitions or permanent collection installations. The internships allow students to engage with primary sources and objects in ways that might be challenging to do within the typical coursework framework. In short, exhibitions can help create multiple entry points into our fields. Okay, so I've talked about exhibitions over the past 25 years that have helped usher the so-called global trend in medieval studies. I've also discussed how these exhibitions establish frameworks to create sustainable pipelines in our field. I'm going to step in a different direction for a moment and discuss two objects, both currently in museums. And these objects touch upon topics of race and ethnicity and the space between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. I will discuss how I've been highlighting representations of Africans within my galleries as a way to disrupt and unsettle narratives usually told about these objects. I hope that this type of work encourages a more diverse generation of students to enter our field. So on June 9th, 2020, the New York Times article evoking history, Black Cowboys Take to the Streets, highlighted the history of African-American cowboys and how their presence challenged the traditional idea of what a horse rider could look like. An integral presence in the Black Lives Matter protests from Compton to Houston, the riders reclaimed the traditional role of mounted riders in demonstration and in urban communities. And just as these cowboys draw attention to Black cowboys' presence in American history, the recent social upheavals have prompted museums to share narratives of Black peoples present in their collection. In the Metropolitan Museum's collection, Black mounted riders are depicted on a tapestry woven textile from Egypt in the late antique period. These mounted riders, woven in Black wool, appear to race across the textile with the hunting dogs. Nude in harness, the men hold stones and bows. A sloping Parthian cap associated with the Near East rests on their heads. Hunting in such images was a prevalent theme in late antique art and appeared across the Mediterranean and wide range of media. Aristocrats flaunted excess through slaughter of animals for sports. And men on horseback have traditionally represented symbols of political, military, or religious power. The other figures in the textile, winged women, and an additional rider, were sewn on pink and white threads. Accompanied by depictions of baskets of fruits, floral bands, and rondos of plump-cheeked ladies, these images are depictions of victory, success, and prosperity. The textile itself shows signs of wear and tear with both ancient and modern repairs, And although we do not know exactly where it was found, it was likely excavated from an Egyptian cemetery in the early 20th century. Textiles like these were wrapped around deceased bodies and were preserved by Egypt's dry climate. The fabric's weight and motif suggest the textile was a wall hanging for a domestic context. So it's almost impossible to know what messages the Black figures would have conveyed to its late antique viewers. The people living in Egypt during this period belonged to a multicultural society. Evidence of Egypt's multiple cultural spheres can be found both in the visual arts and in the text. Multiculturalism is also evident in the numerous languages spoken and written in the late antique and medieval periods. Latin, Greek, Coptic, Arabic, Ethiopic, and Old Nubian are all found on written materials from the region. In late antique texts, authors noted skin color when describing people. The literature discusses the otherness of Blackness, the negativity of Blackness, and the sayings of desert fathers. Prejudice was the mean to humiliate a Black monk, Abba Moses, in a monastery in Egypt. And so one example, another day when a council was being held in Scetis, the father treated Moses with contempt to test him, saying, "Why does this Black man come among us?" When he heard this, he kept silent. When the council was dismissed, they said to him, "Abba, did that not grieve you at all?" And he said to them, "I was grieved, but I kept silence." Sorry. According to tradition, Abba Moses was a reformed robber who lived in the monastic community of Nitria. He eventually became one of the leaders of this community and a revered martyr in the Coptic Church. While aesthetic humility was a value component of monasticism, the color prejudice used to enact this lesson is telling. The short parable suggests the possible otherness of Black bodies in private, late antique Egyptian spaces. It offers insights into the reception of the mountain riders with their foreign dress and skin tone, and an elite private home. So without knowing more about its original context and purpose, it's difficult to say anything more about how the original maker and viewer would have understood this textile. However, given the prominent and deliberate inclusion of figures with different skin tones, we should take a moment to reflect on why it mattered to make these distinctions. The recent focus on racial justice has prompted art historians and museums to re-examine our assumptions about our collective history and culture. This urgent call to correct narratives provides an opportunity to address the multiculturalism in Mediterranean societies, such as Egypt, and to recognize the different experiences Black communities had during the period. So like our modern Black cowboys, the presence of Black mounted riders on the textile forces us to acknowledge a part of history that is little known and waiting to be told. But just as we're focusing on this history, museums are grappling with how to describe these figures on their labels. So to be inclusive or even post-racial, they're often removing the words Black or African from the object's metadata. As we think about the consequences of removing descriptive ethnic terms from these objects, I want to turn to a quote from Frank Snowden. And he says, regardless of the modern opinions as to the precise racial identity of proper anthropological classifications of Cushites, Nubians, and Ethiopians, the Blacks of ancient artists often bear a close similarity to racial types designated in the modern world as colored, Black, or Negro. So Dr. Snowden, who passed away in 2007, was a professor of classics at Howard University and was integral to identifying the presence of contributions of Africans in the ancient Mediterranean world. His formative books, Before Color Prejudice and Blacks in Antiquity, were revolutionary. He highlighted Black and white interactions in classical antiquity by analyzing Egyptian, Greek, Roman, artistic and textual sources. Snowden emphasized that Blacks in antiquity were multicultural and multi-ethnic, a point reflected in the variety of Africans known in the ancient world. It is within this context that this bust of an African child was published and celebrated. So this work represents the diversity and breadth of the classical world, and the province of comparable objects falls within the Roman provinces. So they come from Britain, Portugal, Bulgaria, Germany, and Syria, and Egypt, where there are objects found. These vessels depicted mythological gods, fantastical creatures, boxers, Africans. And a distinctive feature of these vessels was the ways in which they symbolized otherness. So in any place in the Roman Empire, this child would have been distinguished by his or her African features. In other words, the ethnic identity of a child is integral to understanding this work's original function as an object that signifies an other. The child's African features prejudice modern interpretations of the vessels. The object's card described the youth as a Negro head perfume vase. And then in the handbook of the Red States, the Rhode Island School of Design's handbook that was published in 1985, an entry describes the child as both a Nubian youth and a Negro captive, who turns his head angrily, staring up at his captor, his lips parted, his brows furrowed. This fictional description hinges on the Blackness of the child and the memories of a colonial Africa. While derogatory descriptions of such objects abound, representations of Blacks in the corpus of classical art symbolizes a pre-colonial history of Black peoples, a history that's not often taught or honored. In Hands of Ethiopia, W.B. Du Bois, a colleague of Dr. Snowden, remarked on the displacement of Africa from the history of Western civilization. He said, there are those who would write world history and leave out of account this most marvelous of continents. This bust of an African child prompts viewers to integrate Africa into the ancient world and situate it within the history before colonialism. In many ways, this child defiantly forces the viewer to wrestle with ideas of race and Western civilization and history. Yes, in this Roman context, this child likely symbolized an other, but the nuanced representation too bears a close similarity to racial types designated in our modern world. I know that many museums are trying to decide how to label objects and display objects like these, and many recently have removed ethnic words from the label. So for example, some curators are pushing to title this object just as bust of a child instead of African child. To me, I think the lack of description further erases this child from the history because that removes the objects from the corpus of other similar representations of Africans. Recently, I've been pushing to tell these complicated interpretation of objects like these on labels, through programming and talks and small exhibitions, so that these Black peoples are fully seen in these spaces, so that other people of color can see themselves in these Western-focused galleries. And by doing this, we can highlight little-known stories that might encourage people to want to know more about the period. So my talk today addressed three aspects of curatorial work. The first, the development of exhibitions as a means to present the global Middle Ages to the public, work we've been doing. Exhibitions are the first entry points to the medieval world for many people, and we have the opportunity to share multifaceted perspectives of the medieval period. Then I discussed how exhibitions and their development could provide opportunities for more BIPOCs to enter the field. Still, no one museum can do this type of work alone. We have to collaborate across institutions, museums, and universities to develop a diversity pipeline program. I concluded with two short case studies about how I'm thinking about race in my own field and how I incorporate stories of Africans within my gallery spaces. There's much more work to be done, but I'm optimistic that in the future, we'll look at this moment in our field as an essential turning point. Thank you. And so I'm going to turn it to the next speaker. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. So happy to be here with you all. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, great. So hello, my talk today is Teaching the Travail of Writing, Authority, Empire, and Racial Formation in the Pre-Modern. I want to begin by thanking Ayanna Thompson and the RaceB4Race Executive Board for inviting me to be in dialogue with my fellow presenters for RaceB4Race Education today. Thank you to Leah Newsom and Jeff Way for taking such good care of us during this virtual symposium. And thank you to all of you for tuning in. On the first day of my English Composition 5W course, when East meets West, I asked students to analyze a series of pre-modern maps in small groups. The only information I share with them to begin is a digital copy of the map, if available, the name of the cartographer who created it, and the date it was made. Together, they make observations about what they see and attempt to derive some significance about those observations based on what they already know about maps. After they've wrestled with the image, I ask them to research the map and cartographer with the intention of teaching the class what they've learned, including details and information they gathered during their research about the map, as well as their initial assumptions from the first part of the activity. The group who is assigned the Hereford Mappa Mundi is often overwhelmed by the image. I usually overhear comments like, "If this is Earth, it looks like God or something is at the top." Or, "This part with the fish is obviously the water and the part with the buildings is the land." Though I've had a student or two who find Jerusalem, the majority tends to wander the Mappa Mundi looking for something recognizable, but can only make sense of the 12th century map after learning that it, in fact, draws a connection between the geographical and the spiritual. It locates scenes from the Bible according to its presumed geographical positioning, rather than provides, say, coordinates a traveler could use to find their way in the earthly realm. On the other hand, those who explore the Mercator projection recognize it as a map of the world, a map that just might help a traveler plan their route to this or that location. It feels familiar, and they have an easier time locating and naming space. What they find most stunning is the contrast between the extensive detail marking waterways, cities, and important landmarks on the map's eastern hemisphere and the so-called empty space and shapelessness of the Western Hemisphere. In their research about the Mercator projection, they learned that this image is the basis for modern maps, which is why they note it feels more familiar to them. They also learned that Gerardus Mercator, the cartographer, created the map in 1569. This answers their question about the empty Western Hemisphere. The Americas, they say, were only just discovered in 1492 by Christopher Columbus, so Mercator probably didn't have enough information to fill it up. And students assigned to navigate Muhammad al-Idrisi's Tabula Rogeriana, dated 1154, similarly seek out what is familiar, like the blue of the water and the yellow of the land, but cannot make clear determinations about what the image intends to portray. When they present their findings, they describe the image as upside down or the wrong way, to communicate that it has rotated 180 degrees from what they are accustomed to, with the southern hemisphere at the top of the image and the northern hemisphere at the bottom. Their classmates immediately tilt their heads, furrowing their eyebrows as they reorient their bodies to see the map according to a perspective that is familiar to them. "That's so weird," one student yelled out. We spend time debriefing the activity as a large class. For this conversation, I'm less interested in the maps themselves, I tell them, than in our initial assumptions about the maps, the language we used to describe them, and the manner in which we shared the information we learned about them with our classmates. In other words, what narratives might we have inherited that informed the narratives we created about the maps? Students reflect on each group's move to seek out what is familiar in the face of disorientation and the accompanying tendency to make a value judgment on what they deem as unfamiliar, such as when al-Idrisi's map was classified as weird because it was oriented in the wrong way. They also observe how their descriptions mobilize the sanitized versions of colonization that they learned as children and never really unlearned. For example, by classifying the Western Hemisphere of Mercator's projection as empty without offering a critique of this apparent emptiness, they unwittingly perpetuated the erasure of Native communities who were always there and who were murdered and displaced by so-called explorers from Europe. The first day activity comes with a realization that maps are not dispassionate geographical depictions of the world, but rather geographical approximations that are constructed based on how a person or a group of people see the world. The lines that separate this country from that one, the shapes and sizes that represent landmass and bodies of water, even the orientations of the map itself that inform what we, the consumers and readers of maps, prioritize and how we see are all man-made. Edward Said tells us this in Orientalism, where he argues that the West invents an idea of the East, transforming it into an object of study that can be consumed and dominated. The maps my students examine are tangible representations of this knowledge production. They are born out of an imaginative geography, to borrow Said's words, as distinctive objects made by the mind appearing to exist objectively, but have only a fictional reality. The West then assumes a position of authority by simply writing their way into it, as a carefully crafted gift they have given to themselves. One such gift is Richard Hakluyt's Principal Navigations, first published in 1589, with a second expanded 3-volume edition published beginning in 1598. It is a rich archive with hundreds and hundreds of pages of travel documents, merchants' letters, ships' logs, and captured enemy papers from English expeditions to the Americas, Russia, Persia, India, among other places, all amounting to what Nandini Das describes as, quote, the single most significant collection of travel literature ever to be published in English. We begin our examination of early modern transnational encounter by turning to a familiar and favorite early modern pun, the interplay between travel and travail. Renaissance travel writers really loved that travail and travel shared the same root. In fact, travel, as the OED tells us, was, quote, originally a variant of travail, now differentiated in form and sense. At its core, to travail means to labor, to exhaust oneself, to struggle, as a transitive verb to harass, torment, distress, or trouble a person, as a noun, effort, toil, labor, torment, distress, affliction, woman's labor, as in childbirth, exhaustion, weariness. This shared root gave travel writers the opportunity to emphasize the dangers associated with travel. But the pun, of course, doesn't end here. Travel writers not only played on the tormenting nature of travel, but also the tormenting nature of the act of writing. In my course, my students and I interrogate this relationship between travel, travail, and writing when we discuss the prefatory materials from both the first and second editions of Principal Navigations, where Hakluyt describes the labor of compiling these documents. In the epistle to the reader in the second edition, we see not only a list of arduous experiences, which you can read here, that Hakluyt weathered in order to redeem from obscurity travel documents from English expeditions to far-off lands, but also that little has changed in the life of an academic since the early modern period. And I will let you read that quote. Hakluyt has devoted time to this project, from restless nights to painful days, a continuous temporal range accompanied by adjectives signifying discomfort and difficulty. He likewise transcends linear time by travailing between the ancient and the modern at famous libraries as he combs through countless old records, patents, privileges, letters, etc., that he has redeemed from obscurity and perishing. In addition to time, Hakluyt has seemingly been exposed to the elements, strange considering he never actually joined these transnational expeditions. He describes a range of temperatures, what heat, what cold, alluding to the drastic changes in temperature across geographical zones, changes in climate that travelers would have experienced and would have used as evidentiary support in their move to classify human beings according to their phenotypic and behavioral qualities. Finally, Hakluyt describes all he has given up for this thankless job, including fair opportunities of private gain, preferment, and ease. The correlation between the travail of travel and the travail of writing often resonates with my students, all of whom are non-majors and most of whom do not necessarily identify as writers when they start my class. I ask them what they think the correlation means. Why is this pun effective? Their answers boil down to one main point: the association Hakluyt makes between the labor of his writing and editing process and the labor associated with travel builds credibility with his audience. Just on the surface, my students felt seen. His description of the challenges of creating something connected to their fears about having to spend 10 weeks writing for a required composition course they need for graduation. By using language associated with travel, my students concluded Hakluyt establishes himself as an expert in travel. He builds a framework for principal navigations with his own act of writing using language appropriate for the subject matter, acknowledging the challenges associated with travel and doing it twice without any expectations for personal gain, or so he says. The epistle builds trust and positions Hakluyt as a voice of authority, granting authority to the travelers whom he features in the volume because their travel documents have cleared his vetting process. The trust that he establishes is further emphasized in the quote you see here, where he clarifies his reasons for undertaking this burden. Not only does Hakluyt wish to preserve narratives about English exploration before the greedy and devouring jaws of oblivion gobble them up, but also, in so doing, to incorporate into one body the torn and scattered limbs, restoring each particular member, being before displaced to their joints and ligaments. Just as Hakluyt uses language associated with travel writing in order to establish authority, he likewise uses language associated with empire building to consolidate the fragments of English exploration into one unified body. This rhetoric of empire exposes not only Hakluyt's desire to preserve English narrative, but also England's desire to expand its imperial reach. These scattered limbs that tell the carefully crafted stories of English adventures are, in fact, the distinctive objects made by the mind appearing to exist objectively, but have only a fictional reality that Said warns us about. Produced by and for England, these stories are framed as the property of England, the appendages of a sovereign body. By framing these narrative fragments as such, Hakluyt creates a parallel between those stories and the content of those stories, such as the fertile land ripe for the taking, the savages and barbarians who must be civilized, the human and non-human commodities that can be domesticated for economic gain, the lives that are destroyed and violated. These two become England's property with the effortless and violent stroke of a pen. Hakluyt's labor in recovery runs parallel with the explorers' discovery efforts. The territories and the peoples of these foreign lands become objects of study that now belong to England. They have writing to verify it. And Englishmen like Hakluyt and his travelers are simply putting England back together again, redeeming it from certain oblivion at the hands of natives who are, according to these texts, too inept or dangerous to go uncolonized. The effortlessness with which Hakluyt assumes authority through his writing mirrors the effortlessness with which English travelers justify their movements across borders and the violence they leave in their wake. Excuse me. One of the earliest appeals for geographical discovery, economic gain, and imperial expansion through transnational travel comes in 1527 when Robert Thorne, a London merchant, issued a declaration to King Henry VIII to express the urgency of creating new opportunities for English trade beyond England's borders, and to provide his king with very detailed instructions on how to proceed to that end. Thorne explains that, quote, "Experience proveth that naturally all princes be desirous to extend and enlarge their dominions and kingdoms, and it is to be marveled if there be any prince content to live quiet with his own dominions." Thorne appeals to his sovereign from a place of experience as a merchant, as a voice of authority, on how mercantile development can lead a ruler to fulfill the natural desire to, quote, "enlarge their dominions and kingdoms." Rivals in Spain and Portugal, he warns, have already made significant moves to establishing secure routes to the West and East Indies, respectively. But Thorne assures Henry VIII that a northern route has yet to be claimed, and this route eventually led some English travelers to the shores of Canada and other travelers to Russia through the Caspian Sea and into Safavid Persia. To help Henry VIII understand the geographical landscape, he encloses what he calls a, quote, map or card of the world, which he has drawn himself, and which he accompanies with a written description of the image in a long, very tedious account. That's an eyesore. I warn my students about Thorne's self-described prolixity in advance of the assignment. While they may be tempted to rush right through the reading or just skip it altogether, I'd like them to consider why this reading is tiring and, quite frankly, boring. What are the features of the text that make it so? What would be the reason I would assign something like this for our course? And I'll just read a few lines of the passage. Now, to know in what longitude any land is, your lordship must take a ruler or a compass and set the 1 foot of the compass upon the land or coast whose longitude you would know, to extend the other foot of the compass to the next part in one of the transversal lines in the oriental or occidental part. Jumping forward, he's giving us all of these details to show that though this figure of the world be plain, this figure meaning his map, of the world be plain or flat seemeth to have an end, yet one imagining that this said card were set upon a round thing where the ends should touch by the lines, it would plainly appear how the orient part joineth with the Occident. My students begin answering my guiding question by addressing the highly technical and almost scientific tone of Thorne's writing. The detail of his instruction guide the details, of his instruction guide do not simply complement the map included in his letter. They amount to a map that says something about how Thorne, and he hopes his sovereign, sees the world. Bringing together the lessons about maps from our first day and our ongoing discussions about the rhetoric of empire, students acknowledge how Thorne affirms the process by which white, cishet European men establish authority through the travail of writing. Thorne's vision of the world depicted on, quote, this card though little, is one that imagines the earth as contained and navigable. Quote, the orient part joineth with the Occident, if we can only imagine simply, quote, setting the map upon a round thing where the ends should touch by the lines. The world is easily manipulable. Like putty in our hands, we can simply make it do what we want it to. And by we, I'm referring to the universal we, the we that masquerades as an inclusive collective, but really signifies the white cishet European men who have granted themselves permission to enlarge their dominions and kingdoms as though the world belongs to them. As though they can, like the compass in Thorne's description, simply set foot upon the land or coast whose longitude you would know, another redeemed appendage to incorporate into the ever-growing sovereign body. This we has to silence any dissent in order to maintain the ruse of universality, and so it empties the narrative of any memory of the native stories, bodies, and cultures that expose the violence for what it is, reducing this, quote, universal whole world to a series of longitudes and latitudes, to a series of arbitrary divisions that inform how English writers categorized human beings and assigned value to them based on their emerging ideas of race. The long and tedious excerpt I assign from Thorne's vision of the world encourages students to slow down, to sit with the text, to see how whiteness works, to see the rhetorical maneuvers these writers employ to consolidate power. The white makings of whiteness, to borrow from Richard Dyer's book White, become visible with a slow engagement, an idea we've circled back to a few times this week, beginning with Ian Smith and Adrian Merritt on Wednesday, and again with Brenna Duperron's presentation yesterday. This slow engagement is the foundation of cultivating racial literacy. As Ayanna Thompson explained in her opening remarks on Wednesday, we have to be taught to be actively anti-racist. And for that to happen, we have to begin by unlearning and breaking down the ideas that we have inherited, the ideas that that have been ingrained in us without our consent. That unlearning takes time and it takes patience. And it also requires taking responsibility for the vacancies in our curricula that give air to the inherited ideas that erase the pain and violence of colonization and racism. Education can be, quote, a key to unlocking new structures, practices, theories, possibilities, as Ayanna Thompson said. A critical study of race is an invitation to open urgent avenues of expanding our knowledge and understanding, not foreclosing them. Thinking of studying race as a slow engagement does not only refer to the pace we set in a particular course, but also to the momentum we build over time. Anti-racist pedagogy is urgent work, but it is also a sustained process of undoing and becoming. It isn't about a quick fix or simply working in a Black or Indigenous author into our syllabi, quote, without producing new approaches to reading, as Felice Blake argues in her essay, Why Black Lives Matter in the Humanities. It requires a certain amount of humility, of learning with our students so that we can show up for them with the most ethical teaching philosophy we can nurture. We need to do our homework if we're going to ask them to do theirs. In her plenary presentation at Race4Race, Race and Periodization at the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C., Margot Hendricks discussed the more systemic problem within our field to ignore and erase the foundational intellectual labor of PCRS, or pre-modern critical race studies, which she distinguishes from its intellectually lazy stepsister, PRS, or pre-modern race studies. When our colleagues discredit the work of PCRS as anachronistic in one breath and praise its timeliness in the next, even as they claim expertise in a field for which they have not done their homework, it performs the very acts of racism and colonization embedded in our early modern objects of study. And I'm going to read Margot's quote. PRS is the practice of approaching race studies as if you've just discovered the land. Practitioners ignore the pre-existing inhabitants of the land, or if PRS scholars deign to acknowledge the land is inhabited, it's viewed as uncultivated and must be done so properly. In this body of work, all evidence, or nearly all the evidence, of the work done to nurture and make productive the land is ignored or briefly alluded to. In other words, the ancestry is erased. No articulation of the complex genealogy that produced pre-modern critical race studies exists, which in turn drew these academic settlers, and I'm calling them settlers, to pre-modern race. And just like capitalist white settler colonialism, PRS fails to acknowledge the scholarly ancestry, the genealogy that continues to inhabit and nurture the critical process for the study of pre-modern race, end quote. The Academy, therefore, is guilty of reproducing the idea that students internalize throughout their education, and it reaffirms students' associations to the texts they study, most of which are written by white cishet European men without critical intervention, as authoritative. They learn to look outside themselves and toward an imagined ideal for answers. We need to model critical inquiry for our students, showing how to interrogate the assumed authority of a text. I mentioned that my students are all non-majors and that most of them do not necessarily identify as writers when they start my class. It's because they see themselves as distanced from the act of writing, from assuming the identity of a writer, because they tend to see the body of writing assigned by their instructor for the course as a given, as truth, as objective. Good writing happens out there by the guy who looks like that and not by me. What do I have to say that is of value, that could compete, that would actually matter to anyone? As instructors, we have the opportunity to bring these inherited ideas of what counts as a text and what counts as an author into view, to teach our students how to acknowledge whose voices are amplified and whose are silenced. I want my students to take up space in their own writing. I tell them that all the time, to take risks and fumble their way through to discovering what writing means to them. I want them to trust their ideas and their instincts, not to cede their authority to the status quo or to what they think is expected of them. This is something I can teach them by decentering myself, not seeing myself as ceding my authority in the classroom by flipping it, but modeling what it means to have a position of authority and sharing it. I want them to see writing as an opportunity to convey an idea with care and compassion, and above all, to learn that care and compassion in writing is not antithetical to academic rigor. Thank you. And I will turn things over to Barbara, if I can just figure out how to make this thing work. Stop sharing. Okay.
I have to unmute myself. Thank you very much. I'll share my screen now, and hopefully it will work this time. And of course it's not. Stop that. That's not what I wanted to do. This is what I wanted to do. Okay. So now we're cooking with gas. First of all, I wish to acknowledge that this event is taking place on the territories and lands of many diverse indigenous people. Land acknowledgements are not enough, but they are the first step in our unending fight for justice. In the place in which I was born, there were no treaties or recognition, just genocide continuing to this date. Los pueblos originarios, the original peoples, are still victims of a vicious, oppressive system that incarcerates them as they seek justice. For this reason, today, I am honored to acknowledge that I live and work on Treaty 6 territory, the homeland of the Métis. To pay respect to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place, I pledge to educate myself, to look critically at the histories written by the colonizers and their institutions, to show respect to the caretakers of this land, to listen and learn from indigenous peoples, and to support them in their fight for justice. I thank the executive of RaceB4Race for inviting me to speak here today, and to the Arizona Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies for the organization of this event. Please forgive me for taking a moment to introduce my background. You might have read my official bio or maybe heard some introduction somewhere else, but I would like to give you a glimpse of myself that goes beyond my academic credentials. I was born in Argentina, but my parents, who were artists, moved to Venezuela when I was about 3 years old. Because of the 1976 coup, which ended in one of the most violent military dictatorships the continent has ever known, we were unable to return. So I received my education in Caracas. I went to some traditional schools in which we sat at individual desks. When I was scheduled to do my 5th grade, my parents closed our home, emptied their bank accounts, and took me to Europe for a year. I attended 2 different schools in France at lower grade levels. Upon my return to Venezuela, I attended for 4 years a socialist school. It was modeled in Italian methods like Montessori and Reggio Emilia, but it didn't follow either. It was known as experimental model school. It emphasized social skills and political activism over the regular curriculum. Because the year I finished high school was marked by a professor's strike, I was forced to register in a private university run by Jesuits. I'm not Catholic. My family was uninterested in religion. The impact of the regimented class model was something I have never experienced before. Nonetheless, I was determined to pursue an academic career. My curriculum shows that I have degrees from the USA, Canada, the United Kingdom, and I have taught at 4 different universities in 2 continents. I mention these things for you to understand where I come, because it has shaped the thoughts and might enrich your understanding of the arguments that I will put forward. Moreover, I'm convinced that during these times, with the rise of right-wing extremism, we must position ourselves both in background and ideology when we speak or teach. So today, I'm going to talk about our assumptions about pedagogical practices and classroom dynamics. A classroom is designed for a particular demographic and rarely makes a space for those who don't belong to it. Naturally, I make a case to move forward from that status quo and the acknowledgement and implementation of knowledge perspectives that differ from the typical Western standards. The recognition that other ways of knowing are fundamental blocks for the enrichment of academia and the wider community. The word pedagogue has its origins in the combination of pais, child, and agogos, guide. As one of my professors, Eduardo Severino, put it a long time ago, it means the one who leads a child. 30 years ago, this seemed a beautiful image, the teacher as a guide. However, the classroom, particularly the classrooms I have seen, felt old-fashioned, with desks oriented toward the place where the professor would talk. Occasionally, a smaller class would have a table, but rather than peers having a conversation, everyone had internalized the model in which the teacher was the source of knowledge and unconsciously turned towards that person, like sunflowers after the light. Traditionally, education is a means to perpetuate a culture, and in this sense is culturally specific. In a world like ours, the dominant cultural values are transmitted at the expense of the cultural values and perspectives of the oppressed, by the continued discount of views that differ substantially from the status quo. 20 years ago, Philomena Esser conceptualized cultural cloning as, and I quote, the taken for granted desirability of certain types, the often unconscious tendency to comply with normative standards, and the subsequent rejection of those who are perceived as deviant. The concept was expressly coined for the purpose of researching the reproduction of gender and racial biases in academia and beyond. More often than not, we see hiring panels that seek someone who looks and sounds just like themselves. It is common to observe the favor of similarity in the relationship between supervisor and supervisee. The consequence of this is that in an academic context, for example, indigenous scholars are dismissed because their CVs are not in conformity with the so-called traditional academic standards. As a consequence, white scholars who have pursued indigenous studies are ranked higher than their indigenous counterparts. Their research and backgrounds are easily understood and fit within the academic environment. By extension, students are often treated in a similar manner, and people of color often used to promote otherwise astonishingly white and homogeneous environments. This results in epistemic alienation of anyone who, for whatever reason, is marginalized within the Western educational standards. Thomas Hervé Mboa explains the concept as follows. We can define epistemic alienation as the distortion of one's native way of thinking and of seeing and of speaking of one's own reality. In Africa, this cognitive distortion is led by the adoption, unconscious or not, of Eurocentric philosophical, sociological, and historical thought, used to speak, to describe, and to study African realities. Epistemic alienation is symptomatized by epistemicide, destruction of local epistemologies that are replaced, in this case, by a Western paradigm. Anyone without a background in a structure, without a background structure within the boundaries of a narrow epistemological understanding is excluded. This, by definition, then leaves out other knowledge perspectives and modes of expression and knowledge transmission. Here's an example of how epistemic alienation can manifest. While I was doing my PhD, I was often asked to be a teaching assistant in undergraduate Chaucer classes. During those classes, I often heard jokes about John of Gad and Catherine Swynford, or about the relationship between the editors John Manley and editor Rickard. The innuendo about Manley and Rickard made me uncomfortable enough to be put off historical research. The words of professors of the authority had at the time the semblance of truth. I failed to understand then that these were interpretations of records chosen by yet other men. But men are not the only ones to blame. When in Chicago, looking at the Manley and Rickard papers, I was exhorted not to make public anything that might make Edith Rickard appear in a bad light. I cannot be sure what worried the female professor who was concerned about this. What could one uncover about Edith Rickard that would be better remaining in obscurity? And actually the idea that there might be something hidden in those papers makes them all the more interesting. Another interpretation that strikes me as alienating relates to the character of the wife of Bath, sometimes described as a sexual predator, indiscriminate, voracious. The lines most quoted in reference to this are part of the so-called added passages, a series of passages which appear in some key manuscripts and are likely to be Chaucerian. The one in question reads, "Al were he short, long, black, or white, it took no kepe so that he licked me." He licked me. I have heard the wife of Bath described as an adolescent boy, wet dream. I don't even want to start discussing at how many levels this is wrong. In writing, Robinson and Taylor state that within the passages, the one that contains this line is, quote, "where the wife appears to give the clearest possible indication of her voracious and indiscriminate sexual appetite, while others reinforce the impression given by these lines, thus the intimations of violence, sexual and otherwise," end quote. Robinson and Taylor present an opposing but far from objective view, which depends on the variant sitte sotte in line 46. In this way, they rebuild the wife of Bath into something they find more palatable. They assert that, quote, "the wife acknowledges her needs, but indicates her desire to accommodate them in a Christian marriage, albeit a serial marriage, not in liaisons with men who licked me." In all my years reading the Canterbury Tales, I have read these passages rather differently. I interpret this line as to say, "I took no care, but that he pleased me." So in that sense, the wife of Bath is not hung in appearances. Rather, she might be, depending on how you understand, licketh me, be even more choosy than Robinson and Taylor give her credit for. So the MED here offers three meanings for its first definition of licken: to give pleasure, to make happy, or to please. Moreover, the MED uses the very same line in reference for those meanings. Still, we have to decide, licketh me means gave me pleasure, made me happy, or pleased me. The language used by Robinson and Taylor is biased towards their particular impression of the text. Voracious or indiscriminate are not terms I would use to describe her because they carry connotations of a view of female sexuality that are the result of judgments passed by our heteropatriarchal social context. I might say that she is sexually assertive and uncompromising, maybe. But Robinson and Taylor, in taking the passage as to indicate promiscuity, evince how very little they know about the frequent sexual disappointment that women encounter as they engage in heterosexual relationships with men. As an aside, I should point out that Peter Robinson tells me that my beef is really with D.W. Robertson, or maybe F.N. Robinson. But I really don't care much. PMW Robinson, FN Robinson, DW Robertson, or whomever, they are just white male. And to tell you the truth, I don't even care who said it first. I have correctly quoted Robinson and Taylor, whether they want to own the text that they have published under their names or they wish to unload that guilt into others. As white scholars might say, I have difficulty distinguishing them. I use this example of the Wife of Bath prologue mostly to show the ways in which a student of Chaucer might encounter epistemic alienation when faced with the Canterbury Tales, a text plagued with sexual violence, rape, assault, abuse, mistreatment of all kinds, general violence, gender violence, anti-Semitism, murder, and forced rimming. As teachers, it is our duty to handle these matters without creating further violence, particularly when that violence comes from our own overreading or overreaction to the text. This is one of the ways in which we can achieve a semblance of cognitive justice. Cognitive justice allows perspectives that have often been relegated to take an equally prominent place in the ecology of knowledge. Shiv Viswanathan, who first coined the concept, explains it as follows. Quote, cognitive justice recognizes the right of different forms of knowledge to coexist, but adds that this plurality needs to go beyond tolerance or liberalism to an active recognition of the need for diversity. It demands recognition of knowledges not only as methods, but as ways of life. This presupposes that knowledge is embedded in an ecology of knowledges, where each knowledge has its place, its claim to a cosmology, its sense as a form of life. In this sense, knowledge is not something to be abstracted from culture as a life form. It is connected to livelihood, a life cycle, a lifestyle. It determines life's chances, end quote. Perhaps in hearing all professors speak, I should have jumped many years ago with questions as to why the Wife of Bath could not own her own sexuality. I failed then to understand that the character was as threatening to some in the 20th century as it was in 1400. At the time, I was unable to articulate the ideas I expose here today, so I allow micro and micro aggressions to persist. Our understanding of this and other texts and the scriptures we use for the characters and situations should be the subject of careful consideration by teachers, or they run the risk of falling into the traps of epistemic alienation, of which students might not be able to escape. One of the great examples of the overcoming of epistemic alienation in the search for cognitive justice was the public defense of the thesis of Jean Nke Ndi, then doctoral candidate at the Université Catholique de Louvain. Why is my thing not moving? I don't know. There it goes. Sorry. What he did is he presented his thesis to a panel of academics and to the whole tribe of the Bakola Bayeli Pygmies. The thesis was entitled Traditional Management of Forest Ecosystems by Pygmies Bakola Bayeli, Neighboring Bantu in the Face of Neoliberal Exploitation in South Cameroon. And here is a picture of the now Dr. Jan Nkendi. This thesis focused on the traditional knowledge of the Bakola Bayeli, and it was only proper that the tribe should hear the work and its conclusions and have a role in the evaluation of the thesis. For those of us who work in other areas, particularly in European studies, bringing something similar to our classrooms might require innovative approaches to our subjects. I have been particularly impressed by alternative methods of evaluation. Particularly, a successful tool has been the on-essay, a piece of work in which students try different approaches to a subject, and it accepts that knowledge can be expressed in many different forms and not just in the traditional essay. In my work as an editor, I seek cognitive justice by gearing the Canterbury Tales project to produce publications that will contain a series of edited texts. All the traditional textual criticism, it proposes and favors a single authoritative text produced by one or more editors. I propose a system of interrelated texts, each serving different purposes. Some of these will follow the model of the CanTap General Prologue, an application for mobile devices released a year ago. The app includes a reader's text designed for beginners. It contains features aimed to help with pronunciation and understanding. Our scholarly editions, in contrast, will include critical texts focused on scholarly research. During the discussions with editors and collaborators, I realized the depth of the resistance to the theoretical background behind the critical edition I propose. A theoretical background that I have developed after many years of study of both textual criticism and the Canterbury Tales. To be brief, it goes something like this. As we study the many extant witnesses of the tales and we compare them, we arrive to an understanding of the textual relationships. The text of the critical edition will be not a reconstructed text aiming to simulate an archetype or a Chaucerian original, but a constructed text created by a very well-informed scribe. So these texts will not sit at the top of the stemma, but at the base. When discussing these multiple editions of the Canterbury Tales, I face not only resistance, but also second guessing and gaslighting. Underneath this, the constant questioning of my person, not of my scholarship, but because of my background. Who are you to have an opinion? Do you even know what you're talking about? How well do you think you know Middle English? Maybe not well at all. I am the first to acknowledge that my opinions and interpretations are not necessarily right, even though they are based on years of study. These opinions are also subject to change in light of new discoveries and arguments put forward by others. I have been confronted with the question of how would my critical edition will differ from a reconstruction of the archetype. And the shortest answer is hubris. I do not suffer from it. I can hardly claim to have some of the required superpowers for the reconstruction of an archetype, let alone the so-called original. So the longer answer is that even if the results might appear similar, the path I would have followed would have been different. My editing, like my teaching, is burdened by my own marginalization. It is open to change and to exchange. I have internalized my place in academia, and I recognize my ideas as hypotheses and my work as fallible in a field that is a forest of definitive editions and editorial authority. But my background does not mean that I have to work less in an intersectional classroom. Instead, I make sure I put the time to research and improve my teaching strategies, that I strive for openness and inclusion on a daily basis. Our educational system is so oppressive, so intent on suppressing difference and silencing dissent, still today, that still today, more than half a century in age, while leading one of the most important editorial projects in Middle English, I second guess myself. I have internalized the fear that I'm not good enough, that I have not done enough, that I am undeserving of carrying out the work for which I have prepared for so many years. I have to quiet that impulse of seeking approval from the establishment. I fight that every day, not just for me, but for those coming after me. My steps should make the path a little bit flatter, a little bit clearer. But I want to do more. I will not walk this path passively, hoping for a tiny bit of progress for my cause. Rather, I will actively use any tools at my disposal to help others who are also victimized by this oppressive system. This is my call to action to educators. Seek out the marginalized, counsel and support them, create a space in which they feel welcome and accepted, and in which their ways of knowing are valid. And to the students, identify those who are most like you. even if the relationship is not a complete identification. Ask for help, ask for support, be ready to challenge the system, and pledge that when all is said and done, you will do the same for those coming after you. In a zero-sum game, the gains and losses of the participants are balanced against each other. Gains and losses should add up to zero. Implementing a non-Western knowledge model is a non-zero-sum game. The sum of the balance of gains and losses should be more than zero, because we will have enriched ourselves with perspectives embodying other ways of knowing. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. Those papers were so, they worked so beautifully together. They were so fascinating and so powerful. And I appreciated, as I'm sure others in the audience too, just so much the way you have all spoken to these, bigger issues that that we're grappling with, but also found somehow the ability to also pass on such concrete tools and skills and lessons for us to use, in our own research and in our teaching, and just even in the way we move around these objects, right? Like just in the way that we visit a museum even. So we already have some questions, so we're going to move into the question and answer period. But I'm just going to open by giving kind of a very short response and giving all of you, the panelists, a chance to be able to kind of respond or think with one another, because I know you've been in anticipation of talking with one another for a while now. And so now to kind of finally hear your papers alongside one another, panelists don't often have the chance to kind of, everyone asks you questions, but the chance to also turn towards each other. So yeah, I mean, it's so amazing how well your papers work together. And I found that there was just two things that I really found that at least two things that all three of them touched on. One, to use Andrea's phrase, is thinking of these exhibitions, thinking of these objects, thinking of these texts as pipeline initiatives, right? As these introductory or these kind of initial contact that a student, or I love the example of the kindergartner, for example, that a student is going to have with this world, right? And with this maker's vision of the world. And Nedda, in your example, it's very much these like travel narratives, but also the example of the maps, right? And the fact that your students are, you've said, non-majors and they don't consider themselves as writers. And then in Barbara's case, the Chaucer is the kind of one text that a student would read, right? If they're going to be looking at, and that's even for non-majors, right? In an English degree, that's the one they would kind of be exposed to. So thinking about how each of these all of you are thinking of these texts as ways in which, as kind of opportunities or potentials to kind of think about this pipeline, right? To use these texts to think about how can these texts not only show students something, but allow students to engage with them or speak to students and give them kind of some interest or some agency in their engagement, right? Not just with the object, but within the field. And so the second that I thought was really interesting and something that you're all grappling with in such interesting ways is I'm just going to call it the politics of context, right? So how do you contextualize, or how do we contextualize ethically? And so a lot of what you're all pushing back on is kind of this need to contextualize these objects in this kind of objective way, as if they are somehow true, with a capital T, right? And instead thinking about, how do you contextualize while looking in the present, or how do you contextualize while looking towards the future, And so I thought maybe one question that we could start with that could kind of get all of you to think about that in specific is the question of the politics of context, and particularly what do you understand, if you're going to kind of put it briefly, to be the point or the value or the purpose of context and contextualization? And there were such varying degrees of that in each of your papers, from like just kind of give them a map and say like what's going on, you know, towards like what words do you use in these museum descriptions, or whose edition do you give, you know. So I think we'll start there, and then there's a lot of questions coming in, so we'll move forward.
Well,
yeah, sorry.
Please.
No, I was just gonna start thinking about context in the museum space, because one thing that I've been doing is putting precise provenance information on labels and putting things in their archaeological context together in cases. So I've been very forward with them saying that these things need to be in a context in the way that they're displayed, even if it's not aesthetically pleasing, because these are the things that would have been used. So, you know, I don't like the idea of putting all like ivories and metals together. I put things together so people can understand like how things are used within their original context. And so that's how I start that conversation. And, you know, it's difficult because sometimes people want to come into museums and see beautiful things and see beautiful installations. And by privileging context, you kind of disrupt that a little bit, and people get a little confused. Why do we have, you know, some of these textiles that aren't like the best quality with something else? But I think that also people want to learn new things and understand historical accuracy. And so that's how I approach my work with that.
Yeah, I what I would say is, so when I engage my students about the notion of context and why we want to make sure that we're offering relevant context for a claim we're making or a discussion we're having about a particular object, is that when we're able to communicate the context, it gives us sort of the foundation to be able to carry the themes or the processes beyond the context, right? But we have to acknowledge where it came from in order for us to be able to show how it touches different kinds of ideas. And one idea that I bring up to them to discuss the importance of this is how, you know, if I'm talking about, you know, racism or racist language in the classroom, you know, the historical context of something matters, the pattern matters, because so an example I'll give is when I'm in the classroom with my students, I'll say, okay, let's pretend I walked into the classroom and I yelled at everybody, and I was just like, you know, swearing at everybody, yelling at everybody, slamming books around. And then at the end I said, you know, I'm really sorry, I had a really bad day, like, you know, I got bad news and I'm sorry I took it out on you. And then the next day I came to class and I did the same thing. And then the next day I came to class and I keep doing that, right? It's, if someone were to just walk into the room the 25th time I did it, then they might think it's weird, but maybe not really understand why my students hate me, let's say, right? I mean, well, she just had a bad day, why, right? But when they put it into the context of, well, she's done this for 25 days in a row, then they're, you know, the person, oh, okay, that makes a lot of sense now, right? So the context matters for a given situation. And if we're not addressing the context, then we're not really seeing the whole picture.
Yeah, and if I can say something to that, for example, in the case of reading these texts, what is the context? Very few people read the manuscripts, right? And you can try to bring that to the students, but what I need them to remember is that whomever has an opinion and an interpretation of whatever is happening, or of these characters or of these people, they have a background, and that background is not a neutral background. So that is something that the students need to understand, because I didn't initially when I first started Middle English studies, and I allowed a lot of things to happen that shouldn't have happened. And now instead, I have my students question absolutely everyone's authority, because it is important. It's we are talking about interpretations. Unless the text really said it, but how would you prove that? How would you prove that that's not your understanding of what the text says? And then in that case, they ask me, well, so what is the right interpretation? I said, no, as long as you can show that there is a thought process, that you are analyzing this to the best of your ability, and you're using a particular perspective, that is valid. is not less valid than someone that has published some horribly misogynistic article 50 years ago. So.
Great, thank you so much. So now turning to questions from the audience. This one is for Nedda, but a lot of the questions that are even just for one speaker, they speak to the themes that are in your various papers. So if any of you want to also step in and offer something, feel free. So dear Nedda, thank you so much for this talk and the work you do with your students. I am excited to try out your map exercise and wonder if or how you manage students, especially white students' feelings if they used words like weird or strange to describe the map. I know you've gained their trust by that point, but I wonder if you have any strategies you can share with new, younger, and future teachers, maybe referencing Kendi or talking about vulnerability.
Yeah, so I think the thing that I would say first to that is that is the orientation and the question about the concern about the white students and how they will respond. And while that is, of course, a consideration, I want to think more about how all of my students are interacting with one another. I'm not, I don't separate myself from taking them to roads that are going to be uncomfortable, because those roads are going to be generative. And I lay groundwork with them at the very beginning of the course with course norms or community norms that get students to be more comfortable with the idea of the fact that they're going to be uncomfortable in the classroom. So I want them to think more about the fact that we are going to be dealing with challenging topics and to be prepared for that, and to use each other as resources to think through those ideas more. So if there is something that is uncomfortable for any of the students, or if I'm sensing that there's discomfort in the class, I usually just stop what I'm doing and I'll say, I feel like people are uncomfortable. Let's sit and think a little bit about what is it about this that is bringing out discomfort, right? Why do I feel that discomfort? And let's unpack that before we move forward and think about whatever it is that we were discussing. So I'm really sort of transparent with them. I'm really, I feel them out, and I'm paying attention to their nonverbal modes of communication to make sure that they're with me. And I will redirect the course if I need to in order to address a particular topic that might be giving them an acute sense of discomfort, so we can explore what is happening and why that might be on a more meta level.
Yeah, and I loved also so much about what you were saying in your map example, that you're asking them to think about assumptions, right? And so from the very beginning, you're kind of using that word as it's not an easy word. It's a complex word. It's a complex idea, and so you're having them kind of face that from the beginning. So you open space for like thinking about that discomfort in this kind of critical way. Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. So the next question is for Dr. Achi, and so I anticipated these questions coming up, and so there's a few. I'll just read because they're similar, so I'll read two of them. Thank you for a wonderful talk, Dr. Achi. I found your perspective on changing object labels particularly illuminating. What, in your view, is motivating some curators to argue for the removal of the word, quote, African from titles? Is it generally a desire to avoid talking about race altogether, or something else? And then we also have a question. I'm really disturbed to hear that some museums are erasing or removing ethnic descriptors, even as I recognize that they are tricky. How common is this, and how much debate over this practice? How much debate is there over this practice amongst curators and archivists?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for those questions. So this is the debate that we're having right now as curators with African objects. And the reason why some curators want to remove it is really because we don't call objects like a bust of a white man or a picture of a white man. And so they don't want us to do that for Black peoples. But, you know, for me, I think that whiteness and Blackness are different, and like the way that visitors are experiencing those objects in the installation, we can't assume that people are coming in with the same knowledge base. You know, and so, for example, I have some colleagues who are changing like bust of an African child to bust of a Roman child because they were in the Roman Empire. And I just feel like even though they're coming from a good place and trying to create an inclusive language, it just takes so much away from the object, even from a research perspective, because so many people are doing research on this work. And when you remove those terms, it erases it from the metadata. And so, you know, it's not in the back end in terms of databases and for archives. And I think that there's probably freshmen who want to write a paper about African representations of ivories, for example, and they won't even be able to search it in Google Scholar if you remove those terms. And so I think that there's both a need to keep it for our research purposes, but then also to keep it in our discourse, and the fact that there are Africans in the Roman world, and you know, that's what they were. So.
Yeah, and it seems like we've only just come out of a time where we kind of are have convinced people that there were people of color in the Middle Ages, you know. So to do that work just seems to go so quickly against all the other labor. Thank you. So another question. Well, first let me ask. So there's a question about grad students, and it says, how can grad students fight the system that tells them they must represent themselves in the quote racist, or parentheses, racist genres and conventions of the academy? So if you have any quick pieces of advice for how to kind of grapple with that or work around that.
I think I'm working through two possible ways of reading this question. If it's about how to like carry yourself as someone of that particular identity category within the academy, or to represent that identity category in the work that they do. So like I, as an Iranian woman who does work on Anglo-Persian transnational encounters. So that was me working through the question. And so I'm gonna see what my co-panelists
I'm also open to hear what other panelists have to say. I'm assuming that it means like, yes, if you're an Iranian woman, that you're supposed to be working on like, you know, always having something to say on Orientalism, but is that also how you are interpreting this question, other panelists?
Well, I would have interpreted like that too. And for example, for me, is what is, you know, a Latin American woman doing editing Chaucer? I realized recently that I'm the first Latinx editor of the Canterbury Tales. I suspect that, you know, probably of all of Chaucer. But you know, how do you come to that, and how do you reconcile, you know, something that is not apparently related to your background, but there are classicists work in North America and they have nothing to do with ancient Greece. So I don't see why is it that I have to justify it, but what I can do is I can say that my perspective actually is different. I read naturally, I read differently this text just because of my background. And what is important about that is, first, it relativizes everything else. It makes all other perspectives less authoritative, more, you know, individual, and gives it a little bit of, you know, richness to the field. So I say that if you are different in any way, what you're bringing to something that is not naturally what you should do, and what is it naturally what we should do, it's even better, because you're seeing it with new eyes. Supposing that that's the question.
You know, this question is really interesting to me because I've been interested in representation of Africans in the pre-modern world since undergrad. I did classics, and my thesis was about this topic. But when I was applying to PhD programs, people told me I couldn't do work on this topic because I didn't want to pigeonhole myself to focus on Blacks in this period. And so I wrote my dissertation on Coptic manuscripts, and it was still part of Africa, but it was the moment that I got my PhD, I was like, yes, I can do this research again. So, I mean, that doesn't answer the question, but it's interesting how we sometimes choose what we work on based on like job market prospects and what is suitable to be a dissertation topic.
I would say to a graduate student who's navigating this is write what you want to write, work on what you want to work on, and find the mentors who will support you in that endeavor. If you are in a situation where you're sort of like in the program and you're being ushered in a different direction, I think, you know, in the best scenario, if someone is well-meaning and they're saying that, and you feel you can communicate and say, I actually really would love to study this other thing, not to do that work, then communicate that. And then if that's not the case, if it feels like more like a toxic environment, then I think, I mean, I might not be a good person to ask about that, because if I'm in a toxic environment, I remove myself from it. So I don't, and I know that doesn't work for everybody. So I don't know that I necessarily have great advice for that. But finding a way to nurture yourself and do what brings you joy as you try to work through and you know, complete your work as a graduate student. But I think it's really important to listen to like what your core truth is telling you to do, and for you to follow that. And that's just, I think, an important thing to do in life in general, but also in graduate school.
Thank you. I'm sure many will appreciate hearing this. Okay, so next question. Absolutely fabulous talk. Nedda, your call for each of us to do our homework is as much a call for racial literacy as it is a step towards a reimagining of the academy itself. Our placements within the intensely stratified and vertically oriented academic hierarchy often reinforce the, quote, racial blind spots Ian Smith forewarns us. What I'm interested in getting your thoughts on is academic abolition. How can we as BIPOC scholars reimagine the academy beyond simply, quote, decolonizing syllabi? And for all of you, any panelists who'd like to answer.
Yeah, so I think for me, this is, if we were face to face, I think this would be a really rich question to just sort of have a dialogue like we used to do at Race4Race. And I think that's something I'm working through myself. My strategy has been to find the little ways to start doing that work. And the first way that I do that is I mentioned being really transparent with my students. I'm like that with regards to how the academy works. So I will often, I teach a composition course on critical diversity studies, and I often bring in UCLA's mission statement in there for their Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusivity. And we do a close reading of the language and think a little bit about the ways in which that language sort of tries to sanitize the problems and the problems of using words like inclusivity. Well, whose ideas are we actually being inclusive of, and are they dangerous ideas, like violent against BIPOC individuals and these kinds of things. So I try to bring what is sort of systematized and institutionalized and make that part of the curriculum, so that students can think more critically about those systems and to think more critically about the system that they're a part of. So that's one strategy that I have, but I would love to hear what Andrea and Barbara have to say too, because I think that's relevant for the work that you two are doing as well.
Yeah, sure. In terms of, you know, for this doing my homework and our homework question, it's really interesting for curators because we're not trained in this way to think even anti-racist curatorial practice. And I've been often frustrated in conversations talking about, the museum's future and the fact that we want to have more diverse perspectives in our installations, but a lot of people aren't doing the readings that's already been there in the field. And I think the issue is that how do we, we don't have time to do everything and to read all the syllabi. And so at the Met, I created a critical race theory working group where we're trying to read one new article a month, but even that seems to be a lot of work. And so I don't really have an answer, but something that I've been thinking about myself is like, how do we train ourselves when we're trying to also, do innovative projects, put together an entire exhibition, but then also be familiar with the scholarship that's being produced so quickly right now, and translate all of that into 150 word label so our visitors can understand what we're doing as well.
Yeah, and I want to say something about how to do that, and I just saw it in practice in a class. I often take my colleagues' classes, just a whole class to see how they manage certain things. And this idea of, for example, having the evaluation be only formative. So that means that this person is evaluating just the number of assignments that you submit rather than the quality. See, you get a qualitative assessment, but that is for your knowledge. If you submit correctly the numbers of assignments, you get top marks, which is amazing. And then, of course, he uses the own essay, which to me was an incredible experience to see what the students would produce when they were not necessarily forced to write a text. Not everybody comes from a educational environment where that comes naturally. So it's an acquired skill. So to see how they could express their research in other ways, by painting or music or composing poetry, it was an amazing thing to see. It was not less work for them, which was interesting, because someone can think, oh well, but painting something is easy. No, it isn't. and all the research that went into it builds around it. It's an amazing concept, I think. I don't know if that answers the question.
Great. So we have room for one more question, and I'm going to just kind of mash the last questions into one and kind of give you, the panelists, a kind of option to kind of reflect on final thoughts as you think about these final questions. So the questions are about some of the terms, Barbara, you brought up in your paper about cognitive justice and cultural cloning. And so, the papers are, thank you, Andrea, Nedda, and Barbara, for your illuminating presentations. This question draws on things both Andrea and Nedda have us thinking about and what Barbara shared about cultural cloning and internalizing an imposed positionality. I'm curious how things in our field and in our learning spaces for ourselves and our students enact a kind of cultural cloning and impose a positionality we internalize. Could you share, if possible, what material things you may have come across that perform or enact cultural cloning or impose positions or even racialized BIPOC bodies in our spaces? And the second one is about, to what extent do you openly name a pursuit of cognitive justice? So I think they're related, which is why I thought we could ask both of them. To what extent do you openly name a pursuit of cognitive justice within the respective spaces you address, museum, exhibit, classroom, digital edition, or do you leave such aims implicit?
Well, can I take that, I think? First, I had not before done these things explicitly, but I have started lately. Among other things is because I have internalized this position in which, I listen to what bigger, better people tell me and quietly accept it, but I don't want to do that anymore. I'm a grown-up, pretty old, and I have some opinions, and frankly, they are not necessarily bad. They could be wrong, but I have as much right as anyone else to state them. And now that I have a leadership position in the Canterbury Tales Project, I definitely am moving to an explicit way of presenting this. And I do the same in the classroom. Again, originally I didn't. Originally I just behaved as I behaved because I am the person who I am, but without any understanding of that. And now that has become more explicit. So one of the things that I noticed for years was my students find me really approachable for some reason. And they would come, they will tell me things, they would talk to me as they didn't talk to my colleagues. And I didn't know that that was because of the way that I behave, that is a product of my education. So now I'm much more, outspoken about these things, and I said them aloud. I said them in class, and I try to make sure that people know about my positionality, and then they can then take advantage of that, and also use it for themselves, use it as a model to position themselves differently, evidently. But I hope that is more or less what.
Do you either of you want to give any concluding thoughts on this?
Sure. I mean, my answer is quite quick, which is I'm really just transparent and communicative about all of it, right? So with the idea of whether you address these ideas explicitly about cognitive justice explicitly or implicitly, I do it. I'm pretty transparent about that. So either I'll have readings or activities that sort of name it and get students to think about that, like a supplemental reading material or something like that, where students can talk about the language. Or if we see something is emerging in a conversation, we will talk about sort of the responsibility that we have to one another in order to build a more just world. So yeah, I usually do it more explicitly.
Yeah, and for me, it's difficult because on one hand, I communicate with people through, tours, and that's the only way that I get interactions with people. And so, and it's harder to do these on labels, as I've been mentioning. And then also what's difficult with my area, which is Northeastern African art, is it's not really in any field. So it's not technically medieval or Byzantine or even African, even though it's the works are in the medieval department at the Met. And so how I've been addressing this is, we know that this is a medieval space, but I say that these objects are from Africa, for example. And so it's like those smaller things that I've been doing to get visitors to understand that they're not looking at just Western white art, but, experiencing something different. And so I think that these are small steps that I've been taking within my permanent installation work, but then also my broader exhibition projects. So I'm hoping that 15 years from now, we'll look about at this time and these discussions. And as I mentioned, that I really think that we're seeing a shift across our field.
What a wonderful place to to finish this off. Thank you so much, Andrea Achi, Nedda Mehdizadeh, and Barbara Bordalejo. This was such an energizing conversation, and we've learned so much. So thank you all. And now I'm going to pass it on to Dean Cohen to give some concluding thoughts about this Race4Race Education Conference.
Thanks so much. Wow, that was so good. Honestly, I think this is the first time I've really been looking forward to showing up to Zooms in a long time. It's been terrific. So hi, I'm Jeffrey Cohen. I am the Dean of Humanities in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at the Arizona State University. The Arizona Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies is at the heart of humanities education here at ASU, and is, as you know, under the visionary leadership of Ayanna Thompson, who is trailblazing our future. If you're interested in the other kinds of things we do underneath the humanities, you could do worse than checking out, for example, the Center for Imagination in the Borderlands, which has a big event on the power of poetry in America with poet laureates Joy Harjo and Natasha Trethewey. That is this Tuesday, and they'll be hosted by Natalie Diaz, who's building all kinds of structures consonant with what ACMRS is doing. So I want to thank the presenters and moderators of Race4Race Education for their brilliant and far-reaching insights, wisdom, and conversation. What a transformative 4 days this has been. This morning, I was reflecting on the ground covered and lessons learned. I kept returning to what a brilliant choice of topic education is in its relations to the critical race studies movement. The verb to educate derives from Latin educare, to lead out, to educe, to bring out or develop something latent or potential. Education is a form of leadership that looks to the future, that draws out potential, that is collaborative to the core. The vibrant sessions constituting this Race Before Race have made clear why education so well conveys the stakes of what unfolds in classrooms, in spaces like this symposium, within wide publics. Education is not a commodity to be sold, but a community-driven process without end. Haunted by problems of access and success, education as an institution is broken. We have inherited a system not built for, by, or with the many it should serve. And we've heard that again and again throughout these past 4 days. If we are to imagine something better, and I would offer that every panelist we have heard since this event began Wednesday has been deeply engaged in that future-oriented construction project, then we're going to have to move away from some of the myths that structure our current system. And I would label among them the ones that we kept hearing about over the past 4 days. The myth of excellence, especially in its relation to access and scale, that is lack of access and lack of scale. The myth that everyone starts from the same place. The myth of selectivity, that is the belief that somehow we're better for the number of people we don't admit to colleges, rather than that being something that we should be embarrassed of. The myth of the heroic individual, that is the belief that somehow when students enter, they don't bring with them a whole community. True inclusion means widening belonging beyond any student in a chair. And the myth of the teacher God, the belief that is that education is a one-way street rather than something where we're learning from each other, capacious and communal. Getting beyond those myths, or at least simply acknowledging them as myths rather than truths, would be a great start. We're dedicated to this kind of education at ASU. I can see from this symposium that we are in very good company elsewhere. I want to thank every participant one more time. I also want to thank every past participant of Race Before Race one more time. And I want to thank the executive board one more time. Thank you to President Michael Crow for strategic initiative funding, and to the Hitz Foundation for underwriting this symposium series. And thank you to every audience member who's given up their own resources to fund projects like this one. If you haven't yet had the chance to contribute, it's never too late. You can give at acmrs.asu.edu/give. The next Race Before Race theme is politics and will be hosted by Brandeis University in April of this year. You can keep up to date with ACMRS and Race Before Race events by joining the mailing list at acmrs.asu.edu. In closing, it would be impossible to thank Leah and Jeff too many times. So thank you both infinitely. And of course, the same can be said for Ayanna Thompson. I've had the honor of being her colleague and friend for about 10 years, though honestly, it seems longer, and I mean that in a good way. In that decade, I've seen her transform institution after institution to make them inclusive, more just, more humane. She fully understands that education means leading with. Ayanna Thompson is the most brilliant and generous person I know. Thank you, Ayanna, for all that you have done. A bottle of very good champagne was left at your house by my daughter while we were engaged in this, and it's there for you to enjoy tonight, unless somebody in your family stole it already. I hope not. That bottle is from everyone in this community that you've created, so cheers.
Oh my goodness, thank you all. I mean, I won't reiterate all the thanks, but I would like to thank Dean Cohen for being a true visionary leader and for recognizing the value of Race Before Race at its inception. Thank you for all your support. Thank you to everyone who spoke. Thank you to everyone who watched. Thank you to Leah and Jeff for all your efforts. Thank you to ACMRS, ASU, Hitz Foundation. Goodbye. See you at Politics in April.